One of my favorite leadership lessons is the story of Paul O'Neill leading the turnaround of the struggling aluminum manufacturing giant Alcoa. O'Neill recently passed away just a few weeks after the former CEO of General Electric, Jack Welch. But unlike Welch, O'Neill's passing didn't really get the celebration, the obituaries, the acclaim of Welch. And I think that's a problem. I'm not the biggest fan of how Welch led the sort of neutron Jack turnaround of GE, but I am a massive fan of the way that Paul O'Neill picked the right fight and used it to motivate his team to turn around Alcoa. See, O'Neill joined Alcoa in 1987, and his very first speech as CEO, by almost every single account, was a colossal failure. Now, in most publicly traded companies, when a new CEO comes in, one of the first things you do is you schedule a press conference with Wall Street media, with investment analysts. And so that was what O'Neill and his team did. They scheduled the press conference in a hotel ballroom just a few blocks away from Wall Street. And all of the normal business press came there expecting the normal CEO speech. But that's not what O'Neill gave them. Instead, he took the podium and the very first thing he said was, "I'd like to talk to you about worker safety." Now that was a really odd angle to take. Who cares about worker safety? We care about profitability. We care about stock price. We care about all the things that Wall Street cared about in the 1980s and the 1990s. But O'Neill didn't care about those things. So he continued to drive the safety point home. He talked about how every year numerous employees at Alcoa were injured so badly that they had to take time off of work. He told them of his goal to make Alcoa the safest company, not just in aluminum smelting, but in manufacturing entirely. He intended to make Alcoa a zero accident company. This was a shocking announcement to the Wall Street press because they had come to hear a story about price to earnings ratio, maybe even stock buybacks, but they had come to write down a story about how this CEO was going to manage the books differently so that they would increase the stock price. And instead, O'Neill pointed them to the front line. O'Neill pointed them to the manufacturing process. And he didn't point out inefficiencies. He pointed out risks that they were asking employees of Alcoa to take every single day. And he pointed to them as the enemy. And he said, "I intend to lead the fight against preventable accidents. I intend to fight until Alcoa is the safest manufacturing company in the world." Not knowing how to handle it, not knowing what else to do, numerous people in the press began to raise their hand and ask those traditional questions. They asked about inventories. They asked about price to earnings ratio. And O'Neill squelched all of those questions. In fact, he answered back, "I'm not sure you heard me the first time. If you want to understand how Alcoa is doing, you need to look at our safety record." It became very clear in that moment that O'Neill wasn't talking to them at all. O'Neill wasn't talking to the business press. O'Neill was talking to his front line. O'Neill was talking to the workers, to the employees of Alcoa. He was talking to the plant managers, and he was laying out a plan for making them a zero accident company. O'Neill picked a fight. And everybody thought he was crazy. The press ran from the room. Institutional investors started calling and saying, as soon as the markets are open, we need to sell. People called him crazy. The press had nothing good to say about this stunt that he was trying to pull. But the plant managers, the employees, they listened. And they started the process of making Alcoa one of the safest manufacturing companies in the world. One of the reasons this seems so crazy is that Alcoa's safety record was already pretty good. It was one of the best in the industry. But O'Neill knew that he needed his frontline employees, he needed his plant managers, he needed everyone in the organization to take a deep look at the process they've been using in manufacturing. But he also knew he couldn't motivate people to take that deeper look at the process with something about the stock price and turning around shareholder value. He would later say in an interview that part of leadership is to create a crisis. And he knew that the crisis of the stock price was not going to motivate anybody to take that deeper look at the process. But picking a fight against preventable accidents, that would motivate a lot of people. That was the right fight, that was the right crisis. But his resolve would be tested early and often throughout his tenure as the leader of Alcoa. One time he was awoken in the middle of the night with a phone call from a plant manager in Arizona about a fatal accident that had just occurred in the plant. You see, one of the machines had broken down and one of the newly hired employees figured he could jump in and fix it. So he jumped over a safety rail and ran to the mechanical arm in the machine that had been jammed and pulled out the piece of debris that was jamming it. But when he did that, the mechanical arm swung right back into action and crushed the man's skull. He was killed instantly. Immediately, O'Neill called a meeting. He pulled everybody who was related to the accident into one boardroom, and they studied every single second of that action and identified numerous improvements that needed to be made. O'Neill took responsibility right away. He said in that meeting, "We killed this man. It was my failure of leadership, and it was all of our failures not to enforce the safety standard that would have saved this man's life." And as they studied the accident, they identified numerous safety improvements that had to be made. Everything from additional trainings to repainting every safety rail bright yellow so that it would be obvious and seen. He identified every single thing that they as a company, especially the managers, did wrong to create that accident. Incidents like these would test O'Neill's resolve, and they would test everyone's motivation to stay committed to the fight. But as they did, something amazing started happening. They started winning. They started winning not just to reduce the number of accidents that were happening at plants around the world. They started turning around the stock price. They started increasing revenues. When O'Neill left the company 13 years later, revenue had increased 5-fold. The market valuation of Alcoa had moved from $3 billion to $27 billion. And it wasn't because O'Neill had got them to focus on those numbers. He had got them to focus on a number that was far more important: safety. O'Neill knew that people could be recruited to the fight to save the lives of their brothers and sisters on that factory line. And he knew that almost nobody would be motivated to raise the stock price. In a time where every company's mission statement started adopting words like shareholder value, O'Neill knew that that was not a flag that he could raise and motivate anybody. He knew that turning around the stock price or increasing those revenues wouldn't be the fight, the cause that people would be motivated to rally around. But safety would. I mean, in O'Neill's words, he said part of leadership is to create the crisis. I believe that part of leadership is to find that revolution. In fact, O'Neill is one of my favorite examples of what I call the revolutionary fight. You're in a revolutionary fight. Anytime you can point to the industry or the society or the status quo and say they find this acceptable and we refuse to accept that any longer. O'Neill refused to believe that any level of risk was acceptable when it came to manufacturing. And that revolution rallied everyone to his cause. And it led a revolution not just in Alcoa and not just in manufacturing, but in corporations around the globe to realize that caring about worker safety, worker satisfaction, caring about the lives of the people who work for you, not only is the right thing to do ethically, but has a return on investment itself. And gradually we've moved from that focus on shareholder value to that focus on stakeholder value. But O'Neill was one of the very early revolutionaries, one of the founding fathers of this movement.